Hello and welcome. It is episode number 35 of the Hilarious Humanitarians Podcast. I'm Frances Echeverria, licensed marriage and family therapist.
And I am Deanna Silverman, licensed clinical social worker.
And today we are going to touch on a subject that has been, well, as quickly as it pops into the news with stories about celebrities, it fades away, which is the way it goes. And we want to bring attention to the topic of suicide awareness, prevention, and also some things to keep in mind as we would like to keep the conversation open, even between the reportings of celebrity deaths. And specifically, we're talking today not about specifically Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, but that is what prompted Deanna and I feeling like we needed to do something on definitely a harder note than is our usual podcast. But I think that both of us, with our backgrounds as licensed mental health professionals and in dealing with this particular topic, could bring some light to it and to our audience that maybe has not thought about it in a way that we're hoping to present. So, Deanna, before you and I get started, well, I guess we should give a roadmap to the show, and that is that we're going to talk about the way to talk about suicide. And then also we're going to talk about whether or not it's, quote, contagious. Why is there an increase? Some signs that you should be on the lookout for yourself and others, and where to go from here. Before we get started on our podcast, though, we'd like to remind you, especially today, that we are for informational purposes only. We do not constitute medical advice and are not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, your own mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any question you may have regarding a medical or mental health condition. We always like to throw out there the resource number 211 in your area if you live in the United States to find resources. NAMI is another helpful one, and we'll talk today about the National Suicide Prevention Hotline as well.
And of course, if you feel like you are in an extreme mental health crisis, there's always, obviously, to call 911. Actually, I shouldn't say obvious because sometimes it's not that obvious to people. Call 911 if you feel like you are currently experiencing a mental health crisis.
Yeah, so as we're getting started on the topic today, it was like a 1-2 punch in the last few weeks. 2 continents apart, 2 big names in entertainment and fashion died by suicide. And we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of that. It's sad for the families. It's sad for their fans. But let's start, Deanna, by why we keep saying died by suicide and not committed suicide, which is the more popular, normal, I guess, or common. It's not normal, common thing people say.
I guess I'll say, prior to me being in our field, mental health, I used to say committed suicide. Did you used to say it?
I did until I went to a training. I was at DEF CON in Las Vegas, which is a hacker training with my husband at the time. And there was a young lady who gave a speech about the rising suicide rates amongst the tech community, specifically people who spend a lot of time interacting with people over the internet or over the computer, basically. And her take on it was she was in support of text-based hotlines. So not picking up the phone, but being able to, in this case, just log on and have like a chat menu. And since then, now that there's even text messaging crisis lines. So she made the point that when you say committed suicide, you're calling the person a sinner.
Right. Because words have power.
They matter, and we have to be specific.
Right, exactly. And when we hear the word committed, it's followed by a view that is sinful or immoral, right?
Like perjury, murder, burglary, committed.
The guy committed murder. He committed a rape. He committed a crime. He committed burglary. So we don't want people to. It's not sensitive, and some people are gonna be like, you're being too PC, but it's not that. It's just, we don't want to, in order to break down the stigma and to support each other and try to dismantle the really intense amount of shame that comes with even talking about suicidal thoughts, and to properly support each other, we just want to be mindful about how we're talking to one another. And so I think that this is great that people are listening, because we always have room for improvement, and we're always looking to grow and try to figure out how best we can support one another. And I really believe strongly that this is a tool we can use. Is just kind of just throwing that out and no longer saying committing suicide.
And it's something too that's very small that can make a big impact, because as we mentioned, using the word committed does bring with it the heaviness of someone committing a crime or a sin. Now, I'm sure that there are those that are listening that believe or have heard of people to believe that dying by suicide, taking your own life, is a sin. But we really need to reframe. If there's one thing that I can just right now ask you to keep your mind open, I am so tired of hearing that suicide is a selfish motive. It's a selfish move, because in many of these cases, suicide is the product of mental illness, intolerable stress, and trauma. And so to say, and I think it's gotten better in the last couple of years, but I do come across these very old school kind of, I'm going to say, like macho types that are like, oh, it was weak. It was a selfish thing to do. That's not what this is about at all. There's nothing in our biology that says it's a good idea to take your own life unless you are in a horrible, horrible situation. So moving forward, we ask that we don't portray suicide as a crime, because it does stigmatize those who experience even suicidal thoughts, right, or attempt. So how are you going to reach out if that's like the environment that you're reaching out to?
Right.
So I realize right now we probably just blew people's mind. Like, what? Now you're telling me I have to change the way I talk about it, but it's important.
So if you're sitting there going, okay, that's fine, and I'm open to alternatives. Well, what alternatives are there? An alternative to saying, oh, this person, committed suicide could be, and it does feel harsh. It can feel really like, wow, okay, to say, oh, they killed themselves, or he killed himself, he killed herself. But that is what happened. And so let's talk about that. You can say they took their own life, died by suicide, but we're trying to do away with the word commit. They died by suicide.
So there's been a lot of news, and this, it sucks that situations like this have to be the ones where people start talking about it again. I'm sure you saw social media. You and I talked about it. I sent you a text early that morning of the Anthony Bourdain news, and it was like from then on, boom, the internet was just on fire with news about these deaths. And so the question is, why the increase? Is there an increase? And there's actually been some really interesting information that's come out. When you get into training in the field that we're in, there's lots and lots of information you're given about what to be on the lookout for, who are the types that are more likely to do it, and things of that nature. But according to NPR, and this is a relatively recent article that was actually released June 14th, it says U.S. suicide rates are rising fast, but they're rising faster among women than men. And that gender gap is starting to close. It used to definitely be a male-dominated act. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So typically there's 3 to 4 times as many suicide among males as females. But when the individuals behind this study compared the rise in the rates of death by suicide, and see, I like how they wrote about that, between 2000 and 2016, there was an increase significantly larger for females. So there was a 21% increase for men and boys, and a 50% increase for girls and women. And the biggest area, and this is scary when you think about it, females between the ages of 45 and 64, the suicide rate increased by 60% in a relatively short period of time.
I was reading how they were saying that the middle-aged population, male and female, there's this dramatic rise or increase. in people dying by suicide. And I wanted to know what's going on. And they're just saying that it could be fueled by this like intolerable stress level, unresolved trauma. The opioid crisis was mentioned. Crisis in America is just running rampant, and people are finding themselves feeling extremely helpless and extremely hopeless. So I just thought that that was something to note, because I remember just 10 years ago hearing about like, you really got to look after, and we still do, but I just remember there was a lot of focus on males in their like early 20s.
Because of the impulsivity.
Yes.
That's associated with younger males. And part of that is due to brain development. Mm-hmm. Full frontal lobe brain development doesn't take place until mid-20s. So right. There's impulsivity. And that's also what's involved too when suicide is marked by substance use, is the impulsivity rises. Mm-hmm. So, but you're right. That was the focus, right?
Right. Men. That's what I would hear a lot. I mean, you like dug deeper into like an article. I don't know. I once again, I'm only speaking for myself. I can't speak for everybody else, but I just remember looking back onto the stuff that I was hearing and reading just 10 years ago. It just didn't feel as heavy in terms of the middle-aged population.
Right.
But with that said, like I would also hear, I remember looking back, it was like younger men who were impulsive, and then people like the elderly.
Right. Who are losing their ability to live independently, whose partners and friends are dying because of old age, financial concerns. This article from NPR brings up that many, specifically in women, when they were talking about that middle age increase, is that that generation is the sandwich generation, where you're taking care of older parents and also younger kids. Mm-hmm. Another part of that too is that many people have single parent homes, specifically single mother home, and so there's no time for the self-care and monitoring of your own well-being. And so it seems silly, I know to some, for us to be like, well, you're talking about suicide and self-care, because we stress that so much. But the reality is, if you don't take care of yourself, you don't have any gas left in the tank to take care of other people. And then that's when the hopelessness creeps in. So there is an increase. You can use the numbers as proof to that. Now, the other part is the question of, are suicides contagious? And when I hear that, I cringe. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that? Or have you seen experiences heard of ones where there's like an influx?
I've heard both kind of each side of the spectrum. What I always hear is this huge increase in like the use of the hotline. Right. Like the suicide prevention hotline, there was an increase by like 65%.
Dramatically after the announcement of some of these deaths, yeah.
But for me, I feel, I don't know what the right word here is. Like, people may look at that as like a bad thing, that there's an increase in the amount of calls after a celebrity dies by suicide. But for me, it's like, at least these people are using the hotline to call, and those are lives that have potentially and hopefully been saved. So those resources are being used. I definitely think that for people who have been in the shoes of having like really strong suicidal ideation, or been a survivor of a suicide attempt in the past, like, I think that it could looking back on when I was working in the psych hospital, I remember working with a ton of patients who would tell me, like, after a peer of theirs died, it felt like the monster in them got louder, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
And then they would have to reach out to their toolbox or their support systems. Sometimes they would come back to the hospital because they didn't feel safe in their home, because it was, quite frankly, and understandably so, very, very traumatic to hear about. Not only like, well, it could be a friend, it could be somebody that they admired from afar through the TV, a celebrity. I've heard people say, like, if they can't make it how the hell am I supposed to?
I think that was coming out a lot, especially in terms of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade. Like, they have it all together.
Seemingly, right?
Right. Well, that's like, how could they, they're rich, middle-aged white folk, so what could they possibly, how am I supposed to navigate life if they're not able to get happy? So then one of the articles you said brought that up, the bringing back the old monster, right? Like firing it up. And then also for people who are the surviving family members of people who died by suicide, the news coverage can be incredibly traumatic for that experience, and there's no getting away from it.
Oh, absolutely.
So when we talk about, and one other thing I wanted to bring up too, there's the show 13, what's the 13, whatever it is. 13 Reasons Why. Okay. I have not watched it. So I'm going to stay by that. I've done a lot of reading on it, but I've not watched it because I have very mixed feelings about whether or not, I don't know. It's out there. It's good in that it's opening up the conversation, but I don't know that conversation always goes with the viewing. So I'm kind of torn on it. But again, I haven't watched it, so I'm not going to make any statements about it. But there have been questions as to, does this glorify it?
I actually started watching it.
Did you?
Yeah. I felt like I was getting too many opinions. Okay. And I was like, I felt like I was getting too many opinions on like what the show was or isn't. And I was starting to form my own opinion about the show, even though I'd never seen it. Okay. And it's like a self-check exercise where I have to go like, wait, what am I doing? I don't like having it. Like, I don't want to have an opinion about something I've never experienced. Okay. So I started watching it. And I appreciated how they started the entire series because it's like on Netflix, so like you can catch up. And before it even starts, like the actors have like a disclaimer, and they come on and talk about the sensitive material and this might not be appropriate, and the importance of talking to somebody and just continuing this conversation. And I watched like the first like 7 episodes, and I have a 1.5-year-old. So when I can't even finish a cup of coffee, let alone an entire series, but I'm trying. And so far I don't feel triggered, if that means, like I'm not so far, I don't want to say triggered, but so far I'm not feeling like, what the hell is this? So your social worker spidey senses aren't going off. Right. So far. I don't know. Like I haven't gotten that far. I'm only like 6 or 7 episodes in, but I don't know. I mean, honestly, the stuff that they're talking about right now in the series, like 6 episodes in, like is the main character who died by suicide. Like she went through a lot of similar things that I went through, that I know a lot of girls went through in high school, that could like just really do a number on your self-esteem. And in high school, you're just so, oh God, the whole world revolves around you, and everything is about you. And it's like, we almost can't even help ourselves at that age, thinking that this is just the end all be all to my life. And so if anything, it made me feel like this is why we need to rally around each other and be kind and stand up for one another and do right by one another. So yeah, so far I'm okay with it. I don't want to, like, sorry to be kind of vague. I just don't. Well, no, I mean, so you're refraining from an opinion. Well, and I'm just also like, I don't know if somebody's out there going like, don't ruin it. Okay. I got you. Somebody's thinking that, but like, yeah, I'm right. Give away all the details, but so far I'm like, well, yeah, this is high school and these types of shitty things happen. And okay. So maybe it offers an opportunity to talk about, I will tell you, here is why I have not watched it, and has been a very, very strategic move on my behalf. Part of my self-care is that I recognize the things that are going to be too much for me. I work with clients, I see clients of all varying levels of depression, anxiety, trauma, PTSD. You're helping clients work through some of the nastiest memories they have that are horrible. And when I come home, I read a lot of books that have to do with my work and everything.
I don't watch a lot of TV. And when I come home, the last thing I want to watch is something like that. So when we talk about self-care and knowing what's good for your own emotional well-being, I guess that's my example of recognizing that it's not good for me. The same way super stressful shows like Walking Dead, and as much as I'd love to watch The Handmaid's Tale, I think it's called, those things are just too much.
Oh, I completely agree. Like when I was working at the hospital, like now I'm self-employed and I've kind of stepped away from doing a lot of like really active psychotherapy. Like I'm a supervisor for somebody who's in the field and whatnot, but I'm not taking on any clients currently. And I feel like that's the reason why I was able to watch,
right,
to be able to sit down and watch that type of show, because when I was working and in the field 40 hours a week, there is no friggin' way. No way. Nope. No.
Right.
The only thing that I watch is like dumb reality TV. Mindless, like I can just zone out, like Real Housewives of Orange County is like my jam. I'll watch that. I like Vanderpump Rules. I don't even want to say dumb. I actually I love those shows. And so like it's entertainment for me and I'm okay with that. And I can't do the heavy stuff. It's also why I stopped watching the news literally 10 years ago.
Which is what leads into the next point we want to talk about, as we're talking about opening up the conversation about suicide. Because again, what is going to happen is that it will fade away from social media and news coverage until inevitably the next famous person ends their own life. That is just the way this goes. So we need to open up the conversation so that it's a safe thing to talk about every other day of the week, But one of the things that an article brought up was on ethical reporting of suicide and what that looks like, because this is what's important too. If you're in a place where suicide has touched your life or where you have had suicide ideation, that nonstop coverage and the details can be can be overwhelming and too much. And so there's an article that you found, Deanna, that talks about the ethical way to report such stories.
Right. So this article, which article or no article, honestly, we could have came to this conclusion as professionals in the field, which is we understand that when a celebrity dies by suicide, that the world is going to find out through media coverage. However, what we don't need to know are the particular details in which, like, how they died.
No matter how interested you are in those pieces, that right. We do not need to know.
We don't need to know.
It's not our right to know either.
Right. Like it's so bizarre to me. It really is bizarre that was even a thing to begin with. Why is that? I just don't. Anyway, I'm getting worked up, but.
Actually, Deanna, I'm glad you're worked up about it, because I think one of the things that I think our podcast is good at is calling us out on our own bullshit. And I think it is immature and it's not our right to know the nitty-gritty details of everybody's life. I think maybe we've learned that because people have poor boundaries, and also because of things like reality TV where everybody puts all their stuff out there on social media. But you and I have no right to know the intimate details of people we're fans of. We have no right.
Exactly. I'm just going to read it verbatim. There's this article that talked about Robin Williams' death linked to a rise in the copycat suicides. So what the article says, and this is relevant to what we're talking about right now. It says, although the study could not provide a definitive link, it said that there appeared to be a connection. There was extensive media coverage of Robin Williams' death, in quotations, might have proved the necessary stimulus for high-risk segments of the U.S. population, example, middle-aged men in despair, to move from suicidal ideation to attempt. While the effects of widely reported celebrity suicides have previously been linked to increases in the wider population, the study said specifically media coverage of Williams's suicide was particularly detailed and sensational and was amplified through social media. Whereas then they compared the suicide of Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, right? Mm-hmm. And they said that there appeared to have been minimal impact on suicide rates in his Seattle hometown, partly because of more restricted reporting, the study said. So they talk about how like the media industry can positively or negatively influence imitation suicides, which is what the study was saying, and that the media has to be really, really careful about. We've talked about this before. Like, they just have to be more careful about how they're reporting the news and how much they need to report. It's important for the world to know when celebrities die by suicide that like we looked up to and love and we felt very connected to. But once again, like, we just don't need to know how they did it. The risk of somebody who is high risk being inundated with that type of material can move them from that ideation to making an attempt to end their life.
The article talked about this one from CBS News too, that there needs to be conversation within the media outlets on how to handle it because there's no set guidelines. But you know, at some point you can't. It's like you can't blame some of the initial coverage that was out on these two individuals, designer Kate Spade and chef Anthony Bourdain, was from young reporters who are taught, give the details, but they haven't quite learned the art of which details you don't need to include. So it might not have necessarily even been on purpose that they were being like,
yeah, I don't think for 1 second that, even though, oh man, I get so worked up talking about when mass shootings happen and how the media reports on that. Even though like it drives me up an absolute wall, my blood pressure literally spikes. I'm getting hot, like thinking about it right now, like how angry I get. I still don't believe that anybody's doing it maliciously. It's just ignorant and misinformed. Like they really, I don't know. Like, anybody who's listening to us in journalism or like does news reporting, like reach out to us and let us know. I'm curious, like, is there any type of guideline for you? How is this stuff communicated? Because I'm sure of it that nobody's trying to purposely do harm, not realizing it could potentially be doing harm.
Yeah, but we do need to be aware that our actions have a ripple effect. Mm-hmm. So we should be, this is why we bring up that we should be more cognizant of if we're saying died by suicide versus committed suicide. Some behind the scenes stuff, when Deanna and I decided to do this topic right before we started recording, you and I said, like, we need to be very strategic about the way we talk about this, very careful. And I just think that part of the world we live in, where there's an ability to communicate at our fingertips to a massive audience, that we don't necessarily think critically all the time. And so it's something to keep in mind there. So
it's definitely a skill. Okay.
Yeah.
Everything that I can, God, I'm going to like put this on my tombstone. I can only speak for myself. Truly, like, it is a skill, but I think it's something that we all need to, or I encourage everybody to just hone in and develop that skill of just being really thoughtful and not being strategic in like a manipulative or like you're not omitting anything. It's just, I'm a little bit different off air, right? Than I am when I post something on Instagram or how we talk. Like, it's being thoughtful, responsible.
Right. And just running your mouth off and claiming that people are overly sensitive is ignorant.
Yes.
So hiding behind that, I'm calling bullshit.
It's ignorant, it's insensitive, and it perpetrates shame. Like, see, like, it doesn't do anything good.
No. So
it hurts people.
I will say this, that I guess just a change in, because I work in media when I'm off the air doing the off of this air. I'm on the air doing something else. And that we had a period of time where we were faced with suicides of Chester Bennington of Lincoln Park and also Chris Cornell. And between that time and now, I can tell you this, I didn't have one comment that made the comment that they were weak or looking for an easy way out. That to me is progress, because that's a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. So I guess I just realized that as we were talking about it, that I didn't have some loudmouth asshole that was telling me about how to fix mental health problems because people are too sensitive. Not this time around. Okay. So I'm going to call that positive, I guess, as a takeaway. One thing we wanted to move into is the signs, because as we mentioned, these two individuals, it caught people off guard. There was no like crazy history reported through the news of drug use or, like mental health issues where they were, being covered for being, in and out of the hospital. None of that. So sometimes some people who on the outside look strong and solid are battling some demons that no one is aware of. And really we need to open up that conversation so people can talk about it. So I thought we could go down some behaviors that may indicate someone is suicidal. Again, this is just for informational purposes, but so that you can take note, not just for yourself, but maybe those around you.
And I want to mention too, like, because I've seen and I've heard where people say like, it took everybody by surprise because there was no history. And just because there's no like reported formal diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a history. It just wasn't diagnosed. They weren't treated. They didn't necessarily seek treatment. And I'm not talking about anybody in particular. I'm just
in general. Yeah, we hear that a lot.
So it's just important to know, like, a lot of people that we care about in our lives right now may not have a history on paper.
Right.
But they may not be talking about it or even knowing how to talk about it. And there might be a lot of shame there. And they're just not the type of person that would go to the doctor. Or maybe they did go to the doctor and they're not going to tell you. I don't know. So
right. It's something to keep in mind. The other thing that I would like to point out is that for those that I see this a lot, especially in the practice where I'm at, is that there's a lot of shame wrapped up in I shouldn't feel this way because I have a job, I have a loving family, I don't have a drug use issue, I have a stable place. And so there's a lot of this, what is so wrong with me that this isn't enough? So there is that idea of my problem's not valid enough to come forward. Mm-hmm. It's like I don't have the trauma history or whatever. So totally. These are some things to keep in mind and that could indicate someone is suicidal. Talking about feeling hopeless, trapped, or a burden to others, or wanting to die. Unusual mood swings or withdrawing from family, friends, and usual activities. Giving away important possessions. One example that I've heard and seen is when somebody, starts all of a sudden like coming up with the will and things like that just doesn't kind of line up with, estate planning, I guess, on a normal level. And then also increased use of drugs and alcohol. One other one I want to put in here is if somebody has a period of time, and I've seen this too, where they're really depressed and then all of a sudden it's like snap out of it and they're great. It may not be because the depression's gone. It's because they've made a decision of how they're going to end it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy you mentioned that because that's something I was going to chime in with. If, just as Frances said, like if you notice a loved one is that low mood, depressed, they can't move, they're just in their room, not doing anything, you can see it, they're depressed. And then all of a sudden, literally, like it could be the next day, they're up and about and hyper and elevated, their mood is elevated and they seem really, really happy. That I'm speaking from like the people that I've treated in the hospital. It's just as Frances said, they've made the decision, they have the plan, they're going to execute the plan. And all of a sudden it's this like release of like, okay, I'm no longer going to be in this pain anymore. I'm going to be free of this. And it gives them the energy. And that's actually, we see people who have died by suicide or made attempts is a lot of times when they are in that elevated state of happiness, not happiness, but just feeling elevated, because they actually have the energy to go through with ending their life. In no way am I saying that people who are just strictly depressed, you don't have to worry about them because they don't have the energy. No, that's not what I'm saying. But it is really, really important to be very much aware of our loved ones who might have been feeling or looking like this, and now all of a sudden they're elevated and have these extreme mood swings, and it just is not fitting. Like, we really have to step in and go, what's going on?
Right, because we could be going, oh, they're better now.
Right, exactly. That was my point, is you don't want to just be like, oh, phew, it's over. They're no longer depressed. Look at them. They're having a great time. That's actually a really good time to step in. That not even just a good time. It's imperative that you step in and say, I love you. I'm concerned. Are you feeling like you want to harm yourself? You know, that's the time to be really open with each other.
Right. And we really do need to come at it in a way that's direct and forward. I know that was one of my hardest things clinically, was to get used to telling someone, well, are you thinking about hurting yourself or other people? Like, have you thought about dying? Because part of me is going, I don't want to put the idea in their head. Well, look, the idea has been in their head.
Yeah.
So to just address it compassionately and appropriately, but without sugarcoating or dancing around it. Like, well, I checked and they seemed okay. You know, they talked about specifically that, I think it was Kate Spade. I'm not sure which one, to be perfectly honest. One of them had just talked about having like a great family outing. You know, it wasn't like things were okay, and then all of a sudden they're gone. So it's important to ask those questions and to monitor people's moods. Now, here's the other part. We talked about how there's this tendency for people to talk about how it's a selfish act, because yes, it does leave behind in its wake a lot of pain and loss. However, I saw something that was an interesting photo. It was an artist rendering, I think, of somebody who was suicidal at the time or something, and it showed a noose, right? And on the outside of the noose, it was like looking at a scene, I don't know, a lake or something. And on the outside of the noose, it was all dark. But on the inside of the noose, it was clear, like there was life to it. So the implication being that this person in that moment, that was the only answer to things getting better.
Right.
Especially if somebody is feeling that like they're a drain on their family, that they are, you know, that their friends, they've exhausted resources, or they don't feel like they even have a reason to be this way. So they're ungrateful, and you know, all of these negative things that are going through their head. That's the only answer. There's not a whole lot of logic in that. It's just despair.
Right.
So you wanted to bring up the fact, though, in your situation, you had a period of depression where you just withdrew. And so calling somebody, we always talk about call a suicide hotline, do this or that. And we'll give those numbers, and that's an important resource. But Deanna, you brought up off the air that sometimes that's just not even going to happen.
Right. I think, you know, this week I posted on Instagram myself the suicide prevention hotline. I've done it a handful of times, and I've noticed people talking crap about it, not to me personally, but like, okay, here we go again. And it's like, you know what? Let's be respectful that hotline works for a lot of people, but let's also be respectful and understand that for some other people, the hotline may not work because they simply don't have the energy to call. They don't have the willingness to call. When I went through like a really dark period, I wasn't necessarily, you know, I wasn't at that time necessarily having suicidal ideation or, you know, thoughts, but I was really, really depressed. And something that I kept hearing friends say, I can look back, like I was with my husband, we were dating, and he's a very much a really great support. And he also works from home. So it was helpful because he was always around and like very gentle about like what I was going through. But when I look back on it, it was like 6 months of my life where I didn't have any friends come over, not one visitor.
And you're a really social person.
I have a lot of friends. Like I have a lot of family. I have a lot of friends. I don't have a lot of family, but I have enough. I have enough people. And not one person came over. And what they would say though is like, if they'd call me or text me, they would even say like, I've noticed that you haven't really been good at like responding to text messages, or why didn't you go to that person's baby shower? That's not like you. But no one ever would like knock on the door, show up and ask what was going on. But what they would say is, call me if you need anything. And that call me if you need anything, I really try to, like, once again, I know it's coming from a really good place. And I've been guilty of saying it too. But here it goes again, checking yourself kind of at the door and going, is that the best I can do for somebody? Because if I was really genuinely feeling like that person is in a place where they may need to reach out for help, then I'm just going to show up at their front door with a meal and be like, hey, bud, I love you. I'm coming in, you know? And I think
inserting yourself in there.
Yeah. Inserting myself in a positive way. Yes, I could be received with go away, but most likely I probably wouldn't have, you know? And just as like, and I'm speaking from a place of like, if I had somebody come over to my house with a meal going, I'm coming in because I haven't seen you in 6 months and you're not returning my text messages like you used to, I would let them in. And most likely I would have talked to them about what was going on had they asked. But I was not, looking back, I was not going to call them to be like, hey, I want to talk about my depression. I just wasn't going to do it. I felt like,
right,
as you said, like I'm the client that goes, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I have a nice life and a comfortable home, and I've got a supportive person that I live with, and yada, yada, yada. So I feel guilty and some shame around why I feel this way. So I encourage people to think a little bit harder past saying supportively and lovingly. So the whole, like, call me if you need anything. Like, here, this is my homework for everybody. For anyone that has said that, in the next month, take one of those times, at least one time, and just go to that person's house if you're able to, and just show up with a cookie. I don't care. A cupcake. Just a burrito. I don't care. Like anything.
What's the worst case? You're wrong, and they're like, what?
Yeah,
what's the worst case?
The worst case is you share a burrito and you have some laughs. But the best, yeah, like it's just way more effective and really shows people like, oh, okay, I'm actually thought of and loved. Because when you're in that space, you don't see it anymore.
Right.
You can't see it. And so it's just really dark. Like you said, that imagery about the noose, and like it's dark out here, but inside the noose where it would be around, you know, it's light. Like it's kind of the same kind of concept. So I applaud people that have the strength. And I'm not saying that people who can't say it who can't call are weak. I'm not saying that. I've been that person multiple times where it just takes a different intervention.
Right. And we have to know as many interventions as we can. One thing I wanted to bring up too is when we talked about
it's not a one-trick pony.
Right.
We don't go, hey world, everyone who's feeling suicidal, call the hotline. Like we can't do that to people.
No.
And honestly, we can't do that to the hotline workers. The hotline is there and everybody who wants to call can call. But what about the people who can't call or don't want to call but need intervention?
Yeah. One thing that you made me think about is we talked about how sometimes people will be severely depressed and then all of a sudden they've made up their mind and now they're better. Or people that are starting for that, they've made that plan and now they feel committed to it, right? But they're having second thoughts. I watched a documentary. It's called The Bridge. I watched this several years ago. It's about people that have
the San Francisco bridge.
Yes,
yeah,
they've killed themselves by jumping off the bridge. And in fact, I think that it's a great move on behalf of San Francisco is that they've put up phones and signs, right? Saying, if you're feeling suicidal, if, here are resources, right? Even right there on the bridge where they could be jumping. But they interviewed one young man. I think he was in his early 20s, and he talked about he jumped. And I just said that and I got like chills.
The second he jumped, he went, shit, no.
Right. He changed his mind. Now, he managed to get his body into a position so that when he hit the water, he was able to not completely eliminate the power of the water, because at that point you're like hitting concrete. But he survived. He put himself in a position so that he could increase his odds of living. And so here you have somebody who talked about, like, he was there, he jumped, and he said, oh shit. God, every time I talk about it, I get these like chills. So what I'm saying is that we have to recognize that sometimes it's like when we have a plan and we've like committed to the plan, and sometimes that plan is a horrible fucking plan, but we've said we're going to do the plan. So it's never too late to interject and maybe give somebody a second to think about it.
Right.
By the way, that movie is fantastic. Obviously fantastic in a weird way, but it just is a very interesting look at an iconic structure and how it has become this place where people decide to end their life.
Yeah.
So it's called The Bridge.
And I applaud San Francisco for talk about the money and resources that went into putting up it's like a net, or it's not a net, it's like a barrier, and even making the resources for the signs and the phones, and they've dramatically reduced the attempts made.
Right.
They've invested, they saw a need. It's like, what is going on? I mean, the United States, it's like the suicide is like on the list, it's like the 10th leading cause of death for the United States is suicide. Yet on the list of federally funded research, what is it, like the topics, there's like a list of 283 things that are funded, and suicide is listed as, like, out of 283, it's listed at 202. And number one is like, this is the most funded thing in America. So it's 202 on a list of 283, yet suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. I just applaud San Francisco for doing what they needed to do to protect people.
Right. And I think that having conversations like this, people having conversation, and that's where social media, I think, is helpful, and that when you see this spike in coverage following a celebrity death by suicide, is that it has people talking about it, but we want to talk about it in the right ways. And that's kind of why we've set out with this podcast in that way. So it keeps the conversation going. And it's an ugly, ugly topic. And you could say it is preventable, and that if people didn't feel so desperate, they wouldn't kill themselves. So it's different. I think it feels different inside than like somebody who ends up with cancer. Mm-hmm. So, but we just have to be realistic about the fact that whether it feels okay to talk about, we need to talk about it.
Yeah. There's another article with they were mentioning, I guess Oprah a couple days ago had a comment that, although well-meaning, made a lot of people cringe, for not only cringe, but just feel like, you know what, we need to stop and really discuss this. Just Google it. I don't want to like go into it. It was well-meaning, but we need to be careful about how she said things. You just Google Oprah's quote. But the article goes on to say, positivity has its place and we should honor the lives of all who died, but we won't get anywhere thinking about like the bright side, because there is no bright side. There's literally no bright side to somebody dying of suicide. There's just not. It's tragic, point blank, period. So they go on to say, like, we need action, we need money, we need resources, we need this country to get their shit together and fund suicide prevention. We need to take the shame out of suicidal thoughts. We need to let people know that their feelings are okay, and then support them in that moment, in those moments, in those times, because people go in and out of feeling suicidal. They can. We need to improve their lives and give them meaningful connections. We need to tell people that their lives have value always, not just when a celebrity dies by suicide. And the people we lost, their lives have value too. So just as you've mentioned multiple times in this episode, this conversation needs to keep going. It can't just go away, stop abruptly, and then pick up the next time somebody dies by suicide and we're all sitting there going, this is terrible. Like, I don't know what to do with it. It's so tragic. So it's really, really, really important for us to continue to have these conversations and for people to know that having suicidal thoughts is something that so many of us have experienced, including myself, multiple times throughout my life. But it's understanding the importance, it's seeing that moment and doing everything we possibly can, including the people in our lives rallying around us to make sure that we're going to be okay.
Right. And I think this is a good time to talk about the fact that suicide ideation is more common than people realize.
Right.
The problem is we think if we even mention, and so, let me back up. Suicide ideation does not mean you have a plan to die by suicide. Suicide ideation can be something as vague as people, it would just be better if it ended. People would be better off without me. I just don't want to wake up tomorrow. If you think about it as a spectrum. So I think what ends up happening is people, and I've seen this with clients, they're really hesitant to me to even disclose that, because in their head they're going, you're going to 5150 me, you're going to lock me up in a padded room, you're going to think I'm crazy. But that's not how it goes. There's actually safety planning that's on a continuum as well, based on how intense the suicide ideation is.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I had my own experience with that. Like, I remember after my mom died, it was like a year or two after my mom died, and I just felt like I needed something else, like therapy or whatever it was. Support. When I say whatever it was, I'm just like support groups. I just needed some element of support from people that had been there and gone through a similar loss. Because at 26 years old, losing your mom of cancer, not most of my friends, they hadn't gone through that.
Right.
They supported me and they loved me, but I needed somebody who had been through it. And I remember sitting there, and my therapist was doing her assessment, and she asked me her normal assessment question. And I've asked hundreds of people this in assessments, like, are you currently having any thoughts of harming yourself? And my answer was no. And she said, have you ever had any thoughts of harming yourself? And I'm like, no. And she could sense like my hesitation. And she's like, just flat out said, like, do you want to live? And I'm like, and like, I'm like, this is literally like how I said, like, I can see myself in the room. I could see her. This is exactly how I said it. I was just like, I don't really want to live. I want to go wherever my mom is. I miss her so terribly. I'm not going to harm myself. I have family that would miss me, and I don't want to do that to them. All I'm going to say is, like, I wouldn't be pissed if a school bus hit me. And I'm not even trying to be funny. That's literally what I said.
I have clients that say that, like, could something just take me out?
Yeah. Like, I'm not going to do it. I won't do it. I don't have a plan to do it. I don't have a plan. I'm here. I'm just in a lot of pain emotionally. I'm grieving my mom. She could see that. The therapist could see that. She could see that it was grief. It wasn't somebody who was actively thinking about ending their life. And then I was just like, yeah, but if there's a heaven and I go there, I don't know, like if a bolt of lightning strikes me and I die, then I'll be looking in heaven and I'll be with my mom and I'll be like, thank God. That's how I felt in that moment.
And that's suicide ideation.
Yeah. And I remember talking to a neighbor too, that I like, so interesting in life. Like when you just kind of like let it go and just like, oh God, when I have like no fucks given and I'm just like, fuck, whatever. Like I was so depressed and I was just like walking around. My dog was a godsend. Like I literally adopted my dog 2 weeks before my mom died. So it was like that kind of held me together too. Mm-hmm. And I normally don't talk this heavily to people, especially people that I just meet. And, but this neighbor who I'd never met before, we were talking and I just like told her how I was feeling. It was so interesting. Like, I wonder where she is now. Cause, I never even got her name. It almost felt like she was like an angel or something.
Yeah, just there at the place you needed her.
Right. And she just looked at me and she was like, it's okay. How else are you supposed to feel losing your mom? You're totally justified in feeling how you're feeling. I'm sure you're in a ton of pain. I'm so sorry that you're going, like, it was just so validating. It totally stripped away any kind of like, if she had been like, oh my God, don't talk about that. That's sinful and trying to save me from my pain, to like sugarcoat it and just like, let's not talk about this. Like, then I would have walked away feeling a shit ton of shame. But what ended up happening was me feeling really connected with her. And I ended up having like dinner with her family that night. I don't know where that woman is anymore.
But you're thankful.
But I'm thankful, I wasn't like I said, I wasn't like, that was actually a few months before I even went to see the therapist. I didn't necessarily have a plan at that time, but who knows what would have happened had that interaction had been different. Certain circumstances might have been different. Who knows?
Well, she kept the conversation open. And I think that's the important thing as we're kind of wrapping up this podcast today, is to think about keeping the conversation open. And that just because you're experiencing these thoughts does not mean it's worst case scenario. And there are, like I said, we talked about safety plans that can be put in place when you're starting to feel really depressed. It's so important for self-care. And, typically we wrap up the show with talking about that. I don't know that in light of the material that today it seems appropriate, but I think just important to take care of yourself and to be kind and loving. And also if you're a friend with somebody or a coworker, or colleague or somebody, I mean, this was just a neighbor you didn't even know very well, to recognize the hurt in people and to not be afraid. What is the worst that's going to happen if you remark on the fact that they seem depressed?
Right.
They yell at you and say, get out of my business. Well, at least you tried. Or, you embarrass yourself because they're like, no, that's, I'm just kind of depressed today. Like, it's not that big a deal. What's the worst, that can happen? So I think that's important to talk about. I think as we started out this morning, changing the language so that we can open up communication is super important as well. So as we're wrapping up, if you've been on social media at all, you have seen the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, but it is worth repeating that it is 1-800-273-8255. Also, there is a crisis text line, which in this day and age is an important one to remember, and that is 741-741. In fact, that might be something that we recommend people start to share as well, because we do live in a world where picking up the phone does seem to be a little outdated for a lot of people. There's also tons of resources online, and as we mentioned earlier, 911 if you're in an absolute emergency.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up, we invite you to get online, check out the rest of our library if you've not done so already. We are now 35 episodes in, which is crazy. And we do do appreciate the love and support that we've gotten in reviews and subscriptions, and we ask that you continue to do that. Deanna, if people want to get in touch with you, what's a good way to do it?
A good way to do it is to follow me on Instagram, Hilarious Humanitarian. You can follow our shared account, which is for this podcast, is H Humanitarians Podcast on Instagram. Also, this week, I officially launched my website, is hilarioushumanitarian.com. I know that's shocking, the name, but hilarioushumanitarian.com is up and running. It was a year in the making, but here it is.
We also ask that you spread the word of our podcast too to your friends and family. And we've mentioned before, you can download it on their iPhones and Androids when they're not looking.
Not only that, like grab whoever's phone, subscribe, and then write us a review.
Yeah, we do appreciate it.
5-star review.
And if you'd like to get in touch with me, my real name is Frances, and I'm the LMFT of the pair here. But I do have my social media accounts. They are Shut Up Skippy on Instagram, also on Snapchat. I appreciate that. And the website, shutupskippy.com too. So we will be back next week. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Bye.